Do you know that during the battle in Gaza, 40 ambulances sent by the Emirates were standing at the gate on the Egyptian side, waiting to go into Gaza and provide mobile support for the wounded, and Hamas refused to let them in? Because Hamas has a dead baby strategy. Their goal is to induce Israel to kill as many Palestinian children as possible, to show them on television, and to make the world understandably react as anybody would. Now, you mentioned in reading the report about the 2 young Palestinian girls who were killed on the first day of the war. Hamas sent a rocket and fell short and killed, I think, a 9 and a 12 or 13-year-old Palestinian girl. Palestinian television banned any showing of that, because those were dead babies killed by Palestinians. They only show dead babies killed by Israelis. And so the reason there's a lot you can say. You just about exhausted what the Goldstone Commission. It's interesting that you have that one page, and that's really, you can find probably 5 or 6 or 7 more. But even there, it talks about armed Palestinian groups. It doesn't talk about Hamas. It only talks about Hamas when it talks about them in more or less a praiseworthy way, except when it's Hamas versus Fatah. There is no comparison, though, between how much emphasis is placed on Hamas rockets and how much emphasis is placed on the Israeli actions. And so I think there are good reasons for putting that in perspective.
Sure, I understand that, but given that Israel did not open up its archives, or given that Israel did not open up its archives to Justice Goldstone,
right,
what would you have expected him to do?
Oh, very simple. That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Read the newspapers. Go online. Do research. Listen to Colonel Kemp. Listen to both sides. Israel is an open, free, democratic society. All the criticism is in the Israeli newspapers. Hamas didn't open its archives. Hamas took the Goldstone report people to the mosques it would allow them to see. Because they televised the event, Hamas had total control on what was said. Look, I think Israel should have opened up everything. But Israel's archives are always open. Israel's an open democratic society.
Israel's archives were not open. I apologize for interrupting. And
what do you mean Israel's archives?
Also, I'm sure you're aware of this. I'm sure you're aware of this.
Can you explain the definition? What are Israel's archives?
Sure. I'm sure we all saw the Brandeis debate, and the person that Justice Goldstone debated said for very good reason that Israel decided not to open up its military archives, and I'm sure you're more than aware of that. And also, I think you're undermining the efforts of the Goldstone report.
Sure hope so.
And I did want to cite something specific. I know that Justice Goldstone had telephone conversations with Israeli citizens who wanted to give testimony, but of course Israel would not allow Justice Goldstone to cross into Israel.
But
so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
in terms of reconciling what the Goldstone Commission could have done.
First of all, Goldstone Commission had hearings in Gaza. Israelis are not going to go to Gaza to testify, but they also had hearings in Geneva. And many Israelis came and offered to testify in Geneva. And their testimony, for the most part, was not considered by the Commission. In fact, there was one terrible incident where a woman who was injured during the stay road came to Geneva and testified, and her testimony was totally ignored. And then she went back to Geneva and complained to Goldstone, and Goldstone brushed her aside. Goldstone used the fact, and understandably, because he was annoyed at Israel, but he used the fact that Israel didn't formally cooperate to refrain from doing the research on the material that Israel made available. Israel made available a lot of material. It sent many people up to Geneva to testify. It sent material and documentation. It had NGOs go and testify. But Israel discovered that whenever pro-Israel testimony was presented, for the most part was ignored. Take, for example, Colonel Kemp. Let me throw the question back at you if you think it's fair. Do you think that the Goldstone Commission should have considered Colonel Kemp's testimony in which he said, and he was a military expert, that Hamas was hiding behind human shields and Israel did more than any country in the history of warfare to protect Palestinian civilians? Should they have listened to that testimony?
Of course, the report didn't say or explain the situation, so I would probably need more information on that.
Well, I can tell you what Goldstone said. Goldstone said,
well,
yeah, okay, that's
with
not
all
good enough.
with all due respect, Professor, I don't really think I'm going to take anything you have to say right now very seriously. Considering that,
So let me, if you don't take what I have to say seriously,
with all due respect,
let me, you made an accusation. Let me ask you to take what Goldstone says seriously. I'm reading to you from Richard Goldstone. I would also mention there was no reliance on Colonel Kemp, mainly because in our report we did not deal with the issues he raised regarding the problems of conducting military operations in civilian areas and second-guessing decisions made by soldiers and their commanding officers in the fog of war. We avoided having to do so in the incidents we decided to investigate. Warm regards, Richard Goldstone. You think I made that up? You want a copy?
First off, Mr. Goldstone, thank you for coming here and talking to us. Apologies.
If to be sure if Goldstone were here, Dershowitz would be here.
I hope so. You've talked a lot about what the report said Israel shouldn't or could not do. You've talked a lot about what other sources have said about what Israel should not or could not do. But I want to hear, and I think we all need to know, leaving out the chickens and the Cambodians and the rest of the world, whether they're right or wrong, and leaving out Justice Goldstone, what do you think personally and as a liberal and as yourself Israel should and could do in situations like this in the future?
It's a very, very hard question. I think there are two answers. I believe Israel should move toward ending the occupation of the West Bank and ending the civilian settlements on the West Bank. I hope it can be done. It's not going to be easy to do. It's become harder now. Israel offered to do that, of course, in 2000, 2001. They offered to end completely the occupation of the West Bank and to trade the lands around Ma'ale Adumim and Gilo and others for equivalent amount of land to be given to Palestinians. They offered to build a land bridge between Gaza and the West Bank. I'm not sure the West Bank would like that land bridge now if it goes both ways. And offered to do a great deal. I would like to see them renew those offers. That's the kind of macro issues. But in the meantime, and we live in the meantime, the question is what should Israel do when actions of this kind take place? It's a very, very hard question. We now know there are between 10 and 12,000 long-range, medium-range missiles that Hezbollah has in Lebanon. And what I think it did in both Gaza and Lebanon is it sent a very powerful deterrent message. And it's worked. There have been no rockets from Lebanon to speak of. There have been no rockets from Gaza to speak of. Maybe in the end lives were saved. I would like to see Israel do a complete and thorough investigation of its military actions. I think too many people were killed in Gaza. I do think you can make a case regarding proportionality. I do think that destroying of industries, I made fun of the chicken, but it's food, obviously, and we're talking about destroying sources of food. I think that raises serious questions, but not nearly as serious as the questions involving the killing of civilians. I think there's a lot that Israel can do to rethink. After every war, it has rethought. Remember, the Six-Day War was the cleanest war in the history of warfare. Virtually no Arab civilians died in the Six-Day War. It was a complete military attack on military targets on the ground.